This video essay looks at the practice of evidencing one's work as a clinical art therapist working in the public health and social care sector in England. It begins by noting why art therapists are required to adhere to an EBP framework and how this has come about in a brief history of EBP. To do so, I shall consult a key text for this project, Andrea Gilroy's Art Therapy, Research and Evidence-Based Practice. I shall note how EBP affects the field of art therapy, how it hinders and advances art therapy practice. I utilise David Thorne's illuminations on integrating EBP as part of an art therapist's everyday practice, before looking to the future of art therapy and the research that is vital for the profession not only to survive, but also to thrive. Art therapists provide psychological interventions to client groups within health, social, education and criminal justice systems. To ensure that the work that art therapists do is safe, effective and ethical, art therapists are regulated by the Healthcare and Professions Council, the HCPC. The HCPC standards of proficiency for arts therapists include guidelines on one's professional involvement with evidence-based practice, as well as practice evaluation and audits. But why must art therapists engage in these kinds of tasks? To help find answers, it is useful to consider the history of EBP, which was described by Dr. Andrea Gilroy as a political and social phenomenon, with its roots in evidence-based medicine. In the 1990s in England, EBP became mainstream in public health care. Prior to evidence-based clinical work, one relied on training, experience and expertise on which to base medical decisions. It became increasingly important for medical professionals to be able to easily digest the most current and effective practice so that they could prescribe appropriate treatments. These basic principles filtered down to medical educational contexts too. Organisations that collate, review and disseminate the latest research based on evidence include the International Cochrane Collaboration and the UK branch of the Cochrane Collaboration. They in turn work with the NHS Centre for Reviews and Dissemination, as well as the National Institute for Clinical Excellence. These organisations are pivotal in their provision of guidelines for healthcare professionals, and they also influence the government's healthcare policies. Another reason EBP is central to healthcare provision is the need to cater to a growing population while armed with fewer resources. It is well reported that there is a huge need for mental health resources, with nearly half of all adults in England reporting a diagnosable mental health problem over the course of their lifetime. A solid research base that indicates successful outcomes for a treatment is necessary for it to be recommended in guidelines that health professionals can prescribe. It is then vital for treatments or interventions to have a strong evidence base for them to be utilised by more members of the public with particular diagnoses. This becomes problematic within my field, not least because art therapy is a psychotherapy and not a traditional medical treatment, where EBP has its roots. One could consider that it is the issue of measuring that is at the heart of the evidence debate within art therapy. The randomised control trial has become the gold standard of evidence across the board, yet it seems to be mismatched with psychotherapy. How can such a fixed and objective experiment truly show a picture of how art therapy can benefit individuals? I spoke with David Thorne, art therapist and visiting lecturer at the University of Hertfordshire. He questions measuring art therapy indeed at all.
And I'm not sure when you get underneath all the measures whether it does prove much, really. That there is outcome measures. The other thing is actually the quality of someone's life is quite difficult to measure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So as well as measures, really, if you're doing a proper study, you have to look at what else is happening in the life, some more tangible sort of changes.
This confirms the importance of a holistic approach in art therapy research, but when the RCT is placed on such a pedestal in the public healthcare context, how can art therapists ensure that their practice is valued and recommended through the creation of guidelines? Since the randomized control trial is a ratified piece of quantitative evidence, could art therapists engage in more of these? One issue is that research in itself is a huge task. Indeed, one can dedicate a whole career alone to research, and many practicing art therapists trained before the HCPC required them to engage in research, and so were not trained to do so. We must remember also that since art therapy is a fairly new field, the quantitative evidence that already exists is fairly minimal. Indeed, conducting RCTs is a huge task, and while there have been an amount carried out in the USA, there have not been clear positive outcomes following the few British trials in art therapy. Clinicians have also been fearful of engaging in research, as the scientific measurement-based pathway has the potential to undervalue the work that art therapists do. One might consider that the evidence route is reductive. Do we run the risk of alienating ourselves from the reflective and therapeutic processes that underpin our training? Regardless, EBP is a practice art therapists must engage in. I asked David how he goes about evidencing the work that he does.
Okay. In my working practice, that we work alongside psychologists, and we do regular outcome measuring.
Okay.
So it's supposed to be everyone that we would assess for an art therapy session. We would use certain measures, and then at 6 months we'd use measures, or a discharge, or another 6 months.
Okay.
Yeah.
David helps me to see how individual clinicians can integrate evidence-based practice into their daily work by recording outcome measures, a practice that is also encouraged by my art therapy MA course. This could be as simple as logging statistics of referrals and clinical sessions, exampled here in the context of creating a report for funding. David informs me that he uses Core LD for recording information with his clients who have learning disabilities. He goes on to comment on how helpful it can be to utilize evidencing as a feedback dialogue exercise with some clients.
There's an alliance that measures alliance, really. So the therapist and the service user both fill in how they feel the therapist is going, whether we're working towards goals, how well we're achieving. And I found that really interesting because it actually plots out where there's divergence.
Yeah, it's between the client and the
the therapist. And I think when you have very quick feedback about what the measures are showing, so that the person themselves know, rather than just filling out this form and it just goes off somewhere, when you can actually look at like a depression scale, saying, well, back then you seem to be saying you were more depressed. Is that how it feels? So it becomes part of therapy as well.
Yeah. David's advice could be praised for placing the service user at the centre of evidence collecting and feedback. There still seems to be a large gap between an individual clinician undertaking this process and gaining enough research to influence decision-making on public funds. This could feel overwhelming for a trainee or newly qualified art therapist, but I wonder if by combining Gilroy's ideas, David's advice, as well as my university's guidance, one could take small steps to contribute to the field of growing art therapy research. The government have acknowledged that improvements in mental health care have been slower compared with developments in physical health conditions due to the stronger evidence base that exists in medicine. After accepting recommendations made in the 5-year forward view for mental health, their recent report, A Framework for Mental Health Research, is surely a positive sign. The report advocates for more research in mental health and proposes approaches for this to happen. However, one may be concerned that the paper has been too heavily influenced by existing research, with the paper showing a bias towards prescribing CBT as a psychological treatment. This illustrates the continuing effort art therapists must make to engage with and participate in research culture to make their voices heard. The British Association of Art Therapists could be considered a particularly valuable resource. In 2000, the professional organisation set up a research group, the Art Therapy Practice Research Network, which one can join as a qualified art therapist. Gilroy suggests that art therapists should be engaging with quantitative research, that it is possible to do so, as long as we stand by our values. We should continue to collect qualitative data that we trust too, using a bottom-up approach. She advocates for producing the hard data needed to influence policies, while also resisting the constraint of purely scientific research methodologies. We must also apply our creativity in the dissemination of our research and evidence, transcending the written and utilizing the visual, oral, and performative. Challenging the EBP paradigm is the hill that the new generation of art therapists like myself must be equipped to climb in order to thrive in our field. This video essay set out to discover how clinical art therapists can work in an evidence-based manner. By ascertaining EBP's history, I unpacked the complexities of EBP, which can come down to the quantitative measuring of the mental health interventions that art therapists provide. Recognizing that psychotherapy can clash with the gold standard RCTs favoured in EBP, I look towards academics and professionals in my field for advice on how to gather meaningful evidence while working as a clinician. While I still hold some anxieties around exactly how I shall ensure that my evidence is taken into account by policymakers, I end with a hopeful perspective on working with an EBP framework, using my creative credentials to further the reach of research I shall undertake. Ultimately, I believe that keeping the client at the centre of my practice should be my first priority as a clinical art therapist.